The sound of rotor blades slicing through scorching Afghan air thundered across forward operating base Chapman as the Black Hawk medevac descended through swirling dust clouds. Static crackled from emergency radios. Triage tent. Incoming wounded. ETA 90 seconds. Multiple casualties. Priority. Alpha. Claire Stevens, 38 years old with tired green eyes and prematurely silver-streaked brown hair, stood motionless beside a gurney in the makeshift medical facility. Her faded blue scrubs hung loose on her small frame, and dust-covered combat boots suggested someone who'd spent countless hours moving between helicopter landing zones and surgical tents. The August heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket at 118 degrees Fahrenheit, but Claire's hands remained steady as she checked IV lines with mechanical precision. "Out of my way, nurse!" Dr. Marcus Webb shouldered past her with deliberate force, his pristine surgical scrubs and polished stethoscope gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. At 29, fresh from Johns Hopkins surgical residency, Webb carried himself with the arrogance of someone who'd never treated a gunshot wound outside a controlled simulation. His voice carried across the tent loud enough for everyone to hear. Real doctors handle trauma cases. Behind him, Dr. Ashley Chen smirked while adjusting her designer surgical cap, phone already recording for her medical influencer social media. Stanford Medical had prepared her for prestigious hospital rotations, not dusty combat zones where generators struggled to power air conditioning. Dr. David Park nodded agreement, his Yale medical credentials making him equally dismissive of field personnel who lacked Ivy League pedigrees. Claire said nothing. Her weathered hands continued preparing medical equipment with efficiency born from 18 months of treating wounded soldiers, not textbook theory. Every movement suggested muscle memory developed under circumstances these residents had never imagined. "Seriously," Webb announced to the assembled medical staff, "what can a field nurse possibly teach us about real medicine? We're here to implement proper protocols, not watch amateur hour." The helicopter's approach grew thunderous. Desert sand whipped through tent flaps as emergency communications intensified. Radio operators called out coordinates while combat medics prepared triage stations. In less than 3 minutes, blood would flow, decisions would determine who lived or died, and fabric would tear to reveal scars that told a story none of these overconfident doctors could have imagined. If watching medical arrogance clash with quiet competence in a war zone makes your blood boil, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that like button right now because this story shows what real expertise looks like when lives hang in the balance. Subscribe and smash the thanks button to support stories about unsung heroes who save lives while others chase recognition. Trust me, what happens when that helicopter touches down will completely shatter everything you think you know about who the real experts are in life or death situations. The forward operating base Chapman Medical Facility operated from a cluster of reinforced tents connected by covered walkways, designed to handle the constant stream of casualties from Kunar Province's increasingly violent Taliban insurgency. Generator-powered air conditioning fought a losing battle against Afghanistan's brutal summer heat, while the persistent smell of antiseptic mixed with dust and jet fuel created an atmosphere of controlled chaos that defined forward medical operations. 15 medical personnel staffed the facility, 8 seasoned combat medics who'd treated everything from IED blast injuries to small arms wounds, 4 visiting residents from prestigious American hospitals completing military medical rotations, and 3 field nurses who bridged the gap between battlefield emergency care and definitive surgical treatment. Helicopter traffic remained constant, with medevac runs arriving every 3 to 4 hours, carrying wounded from patrol bases scattered throughout the mountainous region, where Taliban fighters maintained persistent pressure on coalition forces. Dr. Marcus Webb had arrived 1 week earlier, with credentials that impressed everyone and except the people who actually saved lives under fire. Harvard Medical School, surgical residency at Johns Hopkins, published research in peer-reviewed journals, and absolutely zero experience treating traumatic injuries outside sterile operating rooms. His designer surgical gloves remained spotless, his posture perfect, and his voice the loudest in every medical conference where he explained proper trauma protocols to combat medics who'd forgotten more about battlefield medicine than he'd ever learn. "Field medicine is essentially emergency band-aids," Webb declared, while adjusting his spotless surgical cap during the morning briefing. "Real surgery requires controlled environments, proper lighting, and sterile conditions. What happens here is just glorified first aid until patients reach actual hospitals. Dr. Ashley Chen positioned herself for the perfect social media angle, manicured nails, somehow remaining pristine despite the dusty environment. Stanford Medical had trained her in cardiovascular specialties, but her real expertise lay in building her medical influencer brand through carefully curated content about her humanitarian mission to Afghanistan. She whispered to Park, voice carrying just far enough for others to hear, "I honestly don't understand why they sent us here. These people barely qualify as medical professionals. Half of them probably couldn't get into real medical school." Dr. David Park checked his designer watch and mentally calculated how many more weeks remained in his rotation. Yale Medical had prepared him for orthopedic surgery fellowships, not treating blast injuries and gunshot wounds in canvas tents where power fluctuated and sterile conditions were luxuries rather than guarantees. He treated wounded soldiers like fascinating case studies rather than human beings, already planning research papers about primitive medical conditions in forward operating bases. Captain James Rodriguez commanded the medical unit with the conflicted awareness of someone trying to balance visiting doctors' credentials against field staff's proven competence. His West Point education had taught him to respect both academic achievement and practical experience, but watching Webb dismiss combat medics who'd saved hundreds of lives tested his diplomatic skills. Rodriguez had served 2 previous deployments and understood that survival often depended more on adaptability than textbook knowledge. Claire moved through her morning patient rounds with movements that suggested something beyond standard nursing training. Not hospital precision, which involved predictable routines and unlimited resources, but something else entirely. Military bearing disguised as exhaustion from someone who had learned to function effectively under circumstances that would paralyze most medical professionals. Her hands, when checking vital signs, found pulse points in seconds rather than minutes, locating arteries with the confidence of someone who'd performed these assessments under fire. Combat medics noticed these details even when residents remained oblivious to anything beyond their own superiority. Her responses to medical questions carried the clipped precision of someone accustomed to military communication protocols. "Patient temperature," Webb demanded while reviewing charts and demonstrating proper documentation procedures to anyone within earshot. 101.4, Claire replied automatically. Not 101.4 like civilian medical personnel, but military time precision that suggested ingrained habits from previous service. Her medical equipment bag drew attention from experienced personnel who recognized details that residents overlooked completely. Worn leather construction with multiple specialized compartments designed for field operations rather than hospital shifts. Heavier than standard nursing kits, with specialized trauma tools visible through worn zippers that suggested years of intensive use under demanding conditions. When helicopter approaches echoed across the base, Claire's head tilted exactly 30 degrees in an automatic response pattern that combat veterans recognized immediately. She listened not just to engine sounds, but stress patterns that indicated mechanical problems, payload weight, and approach angles that suggested casualty severity. Old habits from someone who'd coordinated countless medevac operations under circumstances where every second determined outcomes. Webb caught none of these subtle indicators. His attention remained focused on explaining proper trauma protocols to anyone who would listen, oblivious to the fact that people around him had implemented these same protocols hundreds of times while he was still memorizing textbook procedures. The morning's first crisis arrived with a convoy casualty report: 3 Marines injured by a roadside IED explosion, 20 kilometers north of the base. Standard protocol involved immediate helicopter transport for surgical evaluation, but initial radio communications suggested complications that would test everyone's abilities under pressure. Webb immediately assumed command of the situation with characteristic overconfidence. Standard triage protocols apply here. Minor injuries proceed to Station 1 for basic treatment. Major trauma cases go directly to Station 2 for surgical intervention. We'll demonstrate proper emergency medicine procedures. Claire reviewed casualty reports with the quiet intensity of someone reading between lines that others missed entirely. Her expression shifted as she processed details that painted a different picture than Webb's oversimplified assessment suggested. "Dr. Webb," she said with careful formality, "I'd recommend establishing Station 3 for ballistic trauma cases. These injury patterns suggest complications beyond standard protocol." Webb barely glanced up from his clipboard. "Station 3? That's designated for terminal cases. These are routine blast injuries, nothing we can't handle with standard procedures." Blast patterns from this type of IED typically produce high-velocity fragment wounds with delayed presentation of internal bleeding, Claire continued steadily. Station 2 lacks equipment for emergency thoracotomy if major vessels are compromised. Webb stared at her with the condescending expression of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Emergency what? Are you attempting to use surgical terminology you don't understand? Opening the chest cavity for direct cardiac or vascular repair, Claire replied without emotion. If major vessels sustain damage from high-velocity fragments, surgical intervention window is approximately 4 minutes before irreversible shock occurs. Dr. Chen exchanged glances with Park, both wondering where a field nurse had acquired such specific medical knowledge. Where exactly did you learn that terminology? Chen asked with barely concealed skepticism. Experience, Claire replied simply, returning attention to equipment preparation while helicopter rotors grew louder in the distance. But helicopters were landing now, and there was no time for further questions. The first casualties would arrive within minutes, and everyone would discover whether Webb's textbook confidence could survive contact with real battlefield medicine. The first casualty stretcher carried Army Specialist Rodriguez, a 19-year-old from San Antonio who remained conscious despite obvious leg wounds and the 1,000-yard stare that combat medics recognized as blast concussion. Webb moved immediately to assert control, his pristine surgical gloves and confident demeanor suggesting someone completely prepared for whatever trauma awaited. Minor trauma case, Webb announced after a cursory visual examination. Transport to Station 1 for standard wound treatment. Nothing here requires specialized intervention. Claire stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the tense atmosphere. Doctor, I'd recommend checking his pupils. Blast concussion often presents with delayed neurological symptoms that aren't immediately apparent. Webb dismissed her suggestion with an irritated wave. Nurse Stevens, please focus on your assigned duties. Medical diagnoses are beyond your qualification level. He turned to the orderlies waiting for instructions. Transport this patient to Station 1 immediately. Claire quietly redirected Specialist Rodriguez towards Station 2 instead, her movement so subtle that Webb missed it entirely. But Sergeant Williams, a combat medic with 3 deployments and more trauma experience than Webb would acquire in his entire career, noticed the intervention and nodded silent approval. Field experience had taught him to trust people who understood details that textbooks couldn't teach. The second casualty required immediate attention. Marine Lance Corporal Chen, 22 years old from Sacramento, had sustained abdominal injuries that painted his uniform dark red despite pressure bandages applied during helicopter transport. His vital signs indicated ongoing blood loss that would require immediate surgical intervention to prevent fatal hemorrhaging. Webb approached with textbook confidence, already planning surgical procedures based on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. Prep Operating Room 2 for exploratory surgery. Standard abdominal trauma protocols apply here. We'll demonstrate proper surgical technique under field conditions. Claire moved closer, her weathered face showing concern that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with keeping a young Marine alive. Dr. Webb, I'd strongly recommend field stabilization before attempting patient transport. Moving him in his current condition could trigger catastrophic hemorrhaging. Nurse Stevens, Webb's voice carried frustrated authority. Please step back and allow qualified medical personnel to handle this situation. This patient requires immediate surgical intervention, not field nurse speculation. The blood pressure readings indicate probable splenic rupture with ongoing internal bleeding, Claire continued steadily. Transport to OR 2 without proper stabilization could cause pressure changes that rupture damaged vessels completely. Webb stopped his preparations and stared at Claire with growing irritation. Are you seriously attempting to question my medical judgment? Are you diagnosing conditions that require years of surgical training to identify properly? Captain Rodriguez watched the exchange with growing unease. The tension between Webb's academic credentials and Claire's field experience was creating exactly the kind of conflict that could cost lives when every second mattered. Other medical staff had stopped their work to observe a confrontation that was escalating beyond professional disagreement. I want to make something absolutely clear, Webb announced, his voice carrying across the entire tent. Medical decisions in this facility are made exclusively by qualified physicians. Support staff provides assistance only when requested. No nurse, regardless of field experience, makes diagnostic decisions or questions treatment protocols established by actual doctors. Claire stood silently, her hands steady despite the accusation, watching Lance Corporal Chen's vital signs on the monitor. Blood pressure continued dropping while pulse rate increased, classic indicators of ongoing hemorrhaging that required immediate intervention. She'd seen these patterns before, under circumstances that Webb couldn't imagine. Now, Webb continued with renewed authority, prep this patient for immediate transport to operating room 2. We'll perform exploratory surgery to identify and repair internal injuries. Standard protocol, proper technique, no improvisation. Claire looked at the monitor readings again. Blood pressure had dropped 8 points in the last 3 minutes. Pulse was weakening. If Webb moved this Marine to surgery without stabilizing him first, Lance Corporal Chen would die before they could even begin the procedure. She made a decision that would change everything. Did you catch those subtle signs that Claire isn't who she appears to be? Comment below if you've spotted the clues that something deeper is happening here. Military veterans watching will definitely recognize these behavioral patterns. Share this with someone who needs to see what real expertise looks like when lives hang in the balance. Claire stepped directly between Webb and the gurney, her small frame somehow creating an immovable barrier despite the size difference. Dr. Webb, with respect, this patient requires immediate field stabilization. He won't survive transport to surgery in his current condition. Webb's face flushed red with indignation. Field surgery? We have proper operating facilities. This isn't some primitive aid station where we improvise medical care. He's lost approximately 15% of his blood volume based on vital sign deterioration, Claire replied calmly. Blood pressure has dropped 12 points in 4 minutes. Transport shock will cause complete vascular collapse before you can establish surgical access. Move aside, Nurse Stevens, Webb commanded, his voice rising with frustrated authority. You're interfering with emergency medical war. This patient needs proper surgical intervention, not field nurse theatrics. I can't let you kill this Marine, Claire said quietly, her words cutting through tent noise like a blade. The medical facility went completely silent. Combat medics stopped their preparations. Orderlies froze mid-step. Even the generators seemed to quiet as everyone processed what they'd just heard. A field nurse had directly accused a visiting doctor of potentially causing a patient's death. Webb stared at Claire with the shocked expression of someone whose authority had never been challenged so directly. Did you just accuse me of incompetence? Did you seriously suggest that I would cause a patient's death? You're about to transport a patient with suspected splenic rupture and ongoing hemorrhaging, Claire replied steadily. The pressure changes alone could cause catastrophic bleeding that would be irreversible under field conditions. How dare you make medical diagnoses above your qualification level? Webb sputtered, his composure cracking under the challenge. Captain Rodriguez, I need this woman removed from my medical facility immediately. She's interfering with proper patient care. Rodriguez stepped forward, his West Point training warring with growing awareness that something unusual was happening. The quiet confidence in Claire's voice suggested knowledge that went far beyond standard nursing preparation. Nurse Stevens, what exactly is your medical background? 18 months field experience here, sir, Claire replied, without shifting attention from Lance Corporal Chen's vital signs. Before that, Rodriguez pressed, sensing evasion in her carefully neutral response. Brief hesitation. Civilian nursing, various hospitals. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed with the suspicion of someone who'd learned to read between lines during multiple combat deployments. That pause, that careful evasion, were exactly what he'd expect from personnel with classified backgrounds who couldn't discuss previous assignments. Meanwhile, Lance Corporal Chen's condition deteriorated rapidly. Blood pressure had dropped into the critical range, while his pulse weakened noticeably. Webb finally checked the monitor seriously for the first time and realized that Claire's assessment was completely accurate, but admitting error publicly would undermine his authority in front of the entire medical staff. Fine, Webb announced with forced confidence. We'll perform preliminary field stabilization, but I'll handle all procedures personally. No improvisation, no field nurse speculation, just proper medical technique. Claire watched as Webb fumbled with field surgical equipment he'd only seen in textbooks. His hands shook slightly as he attempted to establish the kind of emergency vascular access that combat medics performed routinely under fire. Prestigious hospital rotations hadn't prepared him for procedures where hesitation meant death and improvisation often saved lives. Sergeant Williams exchanged knowing glances with other combat medics who'd witnessed this scenario countless times. Stateside doctors arriving with impressive credentials but no understanding of how different battlefield medicine was from controlled hospital environments. Academic knowledge couldn't replace the kind of experience that came from treating trauma under fire. Just as Webb began making his first tentative incision, a mortar round exploded 200 meters from the medical facility. Not close enough to cause damage, but loud enough to shake the tent and rattle medical equipment. Taliban harassment fire had increased lately, with indirect attacks designed to disrupt base operations and test defensive responses. Webb looked around nervously as dust fell from the tent ceiling and equipment vibrated from the explosion's concussion. We need to wait for stable conditions before proceeding with surgery. Patient safety requires controlled environments. Lance Corporal Chen doesn't have time to wait for perfect conditions, Claire said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced these situations before. I'm not performing emergency surgery during active combat conditions, Webb declared, stepping back from the patient. A second mortar round struck closer, maybe 150 meters away. The tent shook more violently as the Taliban adjusted their aim, testing base defenses and trying to disrupt medical operations. Equipment rattled while emergency lighting flickered as generators struggled to maintain power. Lance Corporal Chen's vital signs crashed, blood pressure dropping toward shock levels while his pulse became barely detectable. Without immediate surgical intervention, he would die within minutes, regardless of Taliban mortars or Webb's concerns about controlled environments. Captain Rodriguez faced the kind of command decision that defined military leadership under fire. Dr. Webb, either operate immediately or step aside and let someone else save this Marine's life. There is no one else qualified to perform emergency surgery, Webb began. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams interrupted, looking directly at Claire with the respect that one professional shows another. Are you qualified to perform field surgery under combat conditions? Claire looked at the dying Marine, looked at Webb frozen by indecision and conditions he'd never trained for, looked at Rodriguez's questioning stare that suggested he suspected more about her background than her official record indicated. Yes, she said simply. Webb exploded with indignation. Absolutely not. No nurse is performing surgery in my medical facility. This is completely unacceptable. Captain Rodriguez, I demand that you stop this immediately. Then save his life yourself, Claire challenged, her calm voice cutting through Webb's hysteria. Right now, perform the surgery that will keep Lance Corporal Chen alive. Webb stared at the surgical instruments, his hands trembling, as combat conditions that he'd never faced overwhelmed his textbook confidence. Mortar rounds continued falling, each explosion closer than the last, as Taliban spotters adjusted their fire. The tent shook with each impact, while dust and debris fell from overhead. That's when everything changed forever. The fourth mortar round struck close enough to spray the medical tent with debris and fragments. Plastic sheeting tore as support cables snapped it under the concussion. Medical equipment crashed to the ground while everyone dove for cover except Claire, who threw herself over Lance Corporal Chen to protect him from falling debris and shrapnel. When the dust settled and emergency lighting flickered back to life, Claire's scrubs hung in tatters. Metal fragments had torn through the fabric, leaving her back exposed to everyone in the tent. That's when they all saw what she'd hidden for 18 months. 3 parallel surgical scars ran along her ribcage, precise and deliberate. Not accident scars from civilian mishaps, not ordinary medical procedures. These were battlefield surgical scars, self-inflicted under combat conditions when no other medical personnel were available to perform life-saving procedures. But between those scars, small and unmistakable, was a tattoo that made Captain Rodriguez step backward in recognition. USNFS, Fallujah 2007, Navy Flight Surgeon, Combat Zone. The year Rodriguez had lost half his unit to an insurgent attack on their medical facility. Dr. Park whispered in shocked recognition. Flight surgeon? But that means... Dr. Chen's live stream was recording everything, her phone capturing the moment when a simple field nurse revealed herself to be something extraordinary. That's impossible. Flight surgeons are... Sergeant Williams came to attention unconsciously, recognizing insignia that represented legends among combat medics. Navy flight surgeons were the elite medical officers who served with Marine Corps units, trained to perform surgery under the worst possible conditions. Webb stared at the tattoo with his mouth hanging open, unable to process what he was seeing. Flight surgeon? You're just a You can't be. Lieutenant Commander Claire Mitchell, Rodriguez whispered, pieces falling into place as he remembered classified briefings about Medical Station Alpha, Fallujah, October 15th, 2007. The only medical officer who survived the attack on Forward Operating Base Warrior. Claire continued working on Lance Corporal Chen despite her exposed back, her hands steady as she performed emergency surgery with combat conditions that would have paralyzed Webb. That's classified information, Captain. Medical Station Alpha, Williams said with growing awe, the facility that treated 57 casualties during a 14-hour siege, the flight surgeon who operated on herself after treating everyone else. Rodriguez's mind raced through everything he'd learned about that legendary engagement. Only one female flight surgeon had served at Medical Station Alpha. Only one who'd survived what intelligence reports classified as the most intensive medical operation under fire in modern military history. Dr. Chen's live stream chat exploded with comments as viewers realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Navy flight surgeon. She operated on herself. This is incredible. Someone screen record this. Dr. Park stepped closer, his Yale medical arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. You're the surgeon who saved 38 Marines by performing surgery with one arm while the other was shattered by shrapnel? Claire finished stabilizing Lance Corporal Chen's condition, her surgical technique flawless despite torn clothing and combat conditions. 57 casualties total. The exact number was classified. Captain Rodriguez felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place as he remembered intelligence briefings about heroic actions that had saved dozens of lives under impossible circumstances. Ma'am, you're the flight surgeon we studied in advanced medical training. The officer who held Medical Station Alpha for 14 hours alone after all other medical personnel were evacuated. Heavy footsteps approached the tent entrance, military boots on gravel, multiple personnel moving with purpose. The sound that every combat veteran recognized, senior leadership arriving to assess a situation that had grown beyond local command authority. Admiral James Richardson entered with his aide-de-camp, both men wearing the kind of perfectly pressed uniforms that suggested rear echelon assignments far from forward operating bases. Richardson had come to inspect medical facilities as part of a routine command visit, but helicopter radio chatter had indicated something unusual happening at the medical tent. "What's the situation here?" Admiral Richardson demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers and perfect briefings. Rodriguez started to explain the confrontation, but Admiral Richardson's attention fixed on Claire's exposed back, the surgical scars, the tattoo. His weathered face went pale as recognition dawned. "Sweet mother of..." He caught himself before completing the oath, stepping forward slowly, with the careful movements of someone approaching something sacred. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," Claire finished her final sutures on Lance Corporal Chen, her hands steady despite the shock of hearing her real name for the first time in 7 years. "Admiral Richardson, intelligence reports said you died with the rest of Medical Station Alpha. KIA, body never recovered." "Easier that way," Claire replied without looking up from her patient. "For everyone involved." Admiral Richardson stared at her for a long moment, processing the implications of finding someone who'd officially died 7 years ago, now working as a field nurse under an assumed identity. Then he performed an action that shocked everyone present, including his own aide. He came to perfect attention and rendered a full military salute with the precision of someone honoring genuine heroism. "Lieutenant Commander Claire Mitchell, United States Navy Medical Corps, the Navy Cross you should have received, the promotion you deserved, the recognition that never came because politicians decided your heroism was too classified to acknowledge publicly." Claire didn't return the salute. Her hands remained on Lance Corporal Chen, ensuring his stable condition took priority over military protocol. "Marines stable, Admiral. That's what matters here." But Admiral Richardson held his salute with unwavering precision. "Ma'am, what you accomplished at Medical Station Alpha saved my career. I was brigade commander responsible for those Marines you kept alive when every other medical facility in the region was overrun." Dr. Chen's livestream viewers had reached 50,000, with comments scrolling too fast to read. "Admirals saluting! This is insane. Someone record this. Navy Cross hero, Medical Station Alpha survivor." Webb stood frozen, unable to process the complete reversal of everything he'd assumed about military medicine hierarchy. The woman he'd dismissed as an unqualified field nurse was receiving formal recognition from a flag officer, whose authority extended across multiple theaters of operation. During the emergency surgical procedures, Claire utilized advanced medical monitoring equipment featuring military-grade diagnostic capabilities that maintained precise patient assessment even under battlefield conditions with power fluctuations and equipment damage from nearby mortar strikes. Admiral Richardson finally lowered his salute, his expression mixing respect with concern as he processed the implications of Claire's presence. "Dr. Webb, isn't it?" His tone carried the unmistakable edge of someone who'd received detailed briefings about visiting personnel. Webb nodded nervously, suddenly aware that his entire approach to field medicine was being evaluated by someone whose authority could end careers with a single recommendation. "You just attempted to prevent the most decorated combat surgeon in Navy history from saving a Marine's life," Admiral Richardson continued with cold precision, "because you assumed that field experience was inferior to textbook knowledge." "Sir, I had no way of knowing," Webb began desperately. "You didn't ask," Richardson interrupted. "You assumed. You saw field nurse credentials and concluded that meant lesser qualifications. Classic mistake that costs lives and demonstrates poor judgment under pressure." Rodriguez stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to address broader issues that had been building since the resident's arrival. "Admiral, Dr. Webb and his team have consistently dismissed field experience as inferior to academic training. Their approach has created tension with combat medics who've saved hundreds of lives." "I see." Admiral Richardson studied Webb with the calculating expression of someone determining whether poor judgment was correctable or indicative of fundamental character flaws. "Doctor, effective immediately. You're restricted to observer status only. No patient contact without Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's express approval." Webb's face went white as he realized his career prospects were evaporating. "Sir, I'm a surgical resident from Johns Hopkins with published research, and she's a Navy flight surgeon who performed 63 successful surgical procedures while under sustained enemy fire with a shattered arm and internal injuries," Richardson replied. "Your qualifications are noted and found wanting when compared to proven performance under impossible conditions." Dr. Chen quietly ended her live stream, realizing that her social media posts mocking primitive field medicine would probably destroy her medical career before it truly began. Dr. Park deleted photos he'd taken of backwards medical conditions, understanding that his dismissive attitude toward combat medicine had been witnessed by officers whose recommendations could blacklist him from prestigious fellowships. Sergeant Williams grinned with satisfaction that combat medics felt whenever field experience finally received proper recognition from authority figures who understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical competence under fire. Admiral Richardson addressed the entire medical staff with formal authority. "Let me clarify current command structure. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell is resuming active duty status effective immediately. She will serve as Chief Medical Officer for this facility with full authority over all medical operations." Rodriguez saluted crisp acknowledgement. "Yes, sir." "Dr. Webb, your residency supervisor will receive a comprehensive report detailing your conduct, judgment under pressure, and dismissive attitude toward experienced personnel. Such behavior indicates poor suitability for military medical service." Claire secured final bandages on Lance Corporal Chen while monitoring his vital signs for stability. The emergency surgery had been completely successful, performed under combat conditions that would have paralyzed most physicians, trained exclusively in controlled environments. "Admiral," she said quietly, "I appreciate the recognition, but I'm not seeking to resume command responsibilities. My current position allows me to focus on patient care without the administrative burdens that come with leadership roles." Richardson nodded respectfully. "Commander Mitchell, the Navy needs experienced surgeons who understand battlefield medicine. Personnel with your capabilities are irreplaceable, especially given current operational demands." "I understand battlefield medicine because I survived experiences that destroyed most of my unit," Claire replied with weary honesty. "I chose field nursing specifically to heal without reliving command decisions that determine who lives and dies." "Your choice, Commander, but the rank, recognition, and respect are yours regardless of assignment preferences." Webb found his voice with difficulty. "Commander Mitchell, I owe you a complete apology. I was wrong about everything. Your qualifications, your experience, the value of field medicine. I let arrogance blind me to expertise I should have recognized and respected." Claire looked at him with eyes that held years of accumulated pain from experiences he couldn't imagine. "Dr. Webb, You were trained to believe that academic credentials trump practical experience. The system taught you that prestige matters more than performance. But here's what textbooks don't teach. When mortars are falling and people are dying, experience saves lives, while credentials become irrelevant. Lance Corporal Chen awakened 3 hours later in stable condition. Full recovery was expected thanks to surgical intervention that had prevented fatal hemorrhaging. His first words were barely whispered. "Who saved my life?" Sergeant Williams smiled with genuine warmth. "The best combat surgeon any of us have ever seen, Marine. Where is she?" Claire sat nearby in clean scrubs, no visible indication of the earlier chaos, except for fatigue lines around her eyes that spoke of 18 months treating wounded soldiers under impossible conditions. "Thank you," Lance Corporal Chen whispered. "Just doing my job, Marine." "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Field Nurse Stevens." But Williams corrected him with pride. "Lieutenant Commander Claire Mitchell, United States Navy Medical Corps, the flight surgeon who saved 57 Marines at Medical Station Alpha." Lance Corporal Chen's eyes widened with recognition. "The legendary flight surgeon? From the siege at Fallujah?" Claire nodded reluctantly, uncomfortable with attention that focused on past heroism rather than current patient care. "Ma'am, my unit studied your case in combat medical training. What you accomplished was beyond legendary." "What I accomplished was surviving when others didn't," Claire replied quietly. "Nothing legendary about being the only one left alive." Next week, I'll share another story about hidden heroes whose true identities shock everyone around them when crisis reveals who they really are. These stories matter because they remind us that real expertise comes from experience under fire, not just impressive degrees from prestigious institutions. Admiral Richardson prepared to depart, but pulled Claire aside for a private conversation away from the medical staff who were processing everything they'd witnessed. "Commander, why field nursing? Why hide your identity and qualifications for 7 years?" Claire looked through his tent opening at the desert landscape that had become her world, her refuge from memories that still woke her at night. "After Medical Station Alpha, I couldn't handle command decisions anymore. Every choice meant someone lived or died, and I'd already watched too many good people die because of decisions I made or couldn't make fast enough. But you're wasting extraordinary talent by working below your capabilities. I'm healing, Admiral, from wounds that run deeper than surgical scars. Field nursing lets me save lives without carrying the weight of strategic decisions that determine unit survival." Richardson nodded with understanding, born from his own command experiences. "If you ever change your mind about resuming full duties, I know where to find you, sir." As the Admiral's convoy departed, raising dust clouds that dissipated in Afghanistan's dry air, Claire returned to routine patient care with an atmosphere in the medical facility that had changed completely. The revelation of her true identity had shattered assumptions and established new respect patterns that would define relationships going forward. Webb approached tentatively, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Commander Mitchell, would you be willing to teach field surgical techniques? I realize now how much I don't understand about battlefield medicine." Claire considered his request carefully. "Dr. Webb, field medicine isn't just about surgical techniques. It's about developing a mindset that prioritizes saving lives with whatever resources are available under whatever conditions exist. Textbooks provide foundation, but experience teaches adaptation and improvisation that determines survival. I'd like to learn that mindset. Then stop making assumptions and start listening. Combat medics around here know things they don't teach in any medical school." That evening, after the last helicopter had departed and medical equipment had been cleaned and restocked for the next day's casualties, Claire sat alone in her quarters reading incident reports and patient updates. Her encrypted military phone, unused for 7 years, buzzed with an incoming message from an unknown number. "Commander Mitchell, your surgical expertise required for classified medical operation. High-risk environment. Duration undetermined. Interested parties should respond within 24 hours. Blackwater Medical Division." Claire stared at the message, recognizing code names and organizational references from a part of her life she'd tried to leave buried. Blackwater Medical Division was where her career had begun 12 years ago, where she'd first learned to perform surgery under conditions that most physicians couldn't imagine. She deleted the message without responding, but saved the sender's contact information in case circumstances changed. As night settled over Forward Operating Base Chapman, another message arrived on her secure phone. "Medical Station Alpha survivor verification complete. 3 additional personnel confirmed alive behind enemy lines. Rescue authorization approved pending surgical officer availability. Operation requires flight surgeon familiar with original facility medical protocols. You remain the only qualified personnel with necessary clearance and experience. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she read details about teammates she'd assumed were dead for 7 years. Medical Station Alpha had been overrun during the final hours of that siege, and she'd been evacuated believing she was the sole survivor. 3 of her people were still alive, still imprisoned, still waiting for rescue that required someone who understood the medical facility's layout and could treat whatever condition they'd be in after 7 years of captivity. She looked around her small quarters, at the simple life she'd built treating wounded soldiers without the crushing responsibility of command decisions. Then she looked at her phone again, at coordinates that would take her back to the one place on Earth she'd hoped never to see again. Her fingers hovered over the response keys while outside, another medevac helicopter approached with fresh casualties who would need her immediate attention. Claire pocketed the phone and returned to work, but questions remained. Some ghosts never stayed buried, and sometimes the only person qualified to lay them to rest was the one who'd survived them in the first place. As helicopter rotors faded into the Afghan night, viewers worldwide wondered whether Commander Claire Mitchell would answer that call. Whether the flight surgeon of Medical Station Alpha would face her past one final time to save teammates she'd believed were lost forever. The scars on her ribs told part of her story, but the complete truth about Medical Station Alpha, about what really happened during those 14 hours under siege, about why she'd chosen to disappear rather than accept recognition and promotion, that story remained classified, buried in files that officially didn't exist. Until now. Claire's secure phone buzzed again at 0300 hours, pulling her from restless sleep, filled with echoes of helicopter rotors and distant explosions. The message displayed coordinates she recognized, despite 7 years of trying to forget them. 34.78 degrees north, 69.11 degrees east, Medical Station Alpha. The follow-up intelligence brief arrived encrypted with details that made her blood run cold. Satellite imagery showed the original facility structure still standing, now converted into a Taliban detention center. Thermal signatures indicated 3 heat sources in the underground medical bunker where she'd performed her final surgeries before evacuation. 3 signatures that matched metabolic patterns of long-term prisoners in deteriorating health. Dr. Patricia Doc Williams, Navy Corpsman extraordinaire, who had assisted in 43 surgical procedures during the siege. Captain Michael Steady Rodriguez, Marine Corps medic, who had coordinated casualty evacuation under impossible conditions. Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Chen, Army flight medic, who'd volunteered to stay behind when helicopter capacity couldn't accommodate everyone. Her team, her responsibility, her people who had been classified as KIA when rescue operations were deemed too dangerous to attempt. Claire dressed quickly in clean scrubs and walked through the medical facility where yesterday's revelations had changed everything. Combat medics nodded respectfully as she checked on patients, their demeanor transformed from casual collegiality to professional deference for someone whose legend they'd studied but never expected to meet. Lance Corporal Chen was awake, his recovery progressing exactly as expected from emergency surgery performed under combat conditions. "Morning, Commander," he said with a weak smile. "Feeling good enough to go home soon?" "Not quite yet, Marine. Your body needs time to heal properly." Claire checked his vital signs with the automatic precision of someone who'd performed these assessments thousands of times. "But you're definitely headed in the right direction." "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Claire paused her chart notations. "Go ahead." "The stories about Medical Station Alpha, are they true? Did you really operate on yourself after treating 57 casualties?" 63, actually, Claire corrected quietly. "And yes, when shrapnel from the final mortar barrage severed an artery in my arm, I had to choose between bleeding out or performing emergency surgery on myself while coordinating evacuation for the last group of wounded." Lance Corporal Chen stared at her with the awe that combat veterans reserve for legendary actions that redefine the possible. "How do you find courage for something like that?" "You don't find courage," Claire replied, tucking his chart back into its holder. "Courage finds you when people you care about need you to be stronger than you thought possible." Dr. Webb approached hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect, mixed with curiosity about battlefield medicine that textbooks couldn't teach. "Commander Mitchell, if you're willing, I'd like to observe your patient care techniques. Yesterday showed me how much I don't understand about trauma medicine under real conditions. Claire studied him carefully, evaluating whether his request represented authentic learning desire or attempt to restore professional standing after yesterday's humiliation. Dr. Webb, what do you think is the most important quality for a combat surgeon? Technical expertise, Webb replied uncertainly. Wrong answer. Technical expertise matters, but the most important quality is the ability to adapt when everything goes wrong simultaneously. When power fails, equipment breaks, supplies run out, and patients keep arriving faster than you can treat them. Webb nodded thoughtfully. How do you develop that adaptability? By accepting that perfectionism kills people in combat zones. By learning to make life or death decisions with incomplete information. By understanding that saving 60% of your patients with improvised techniques is better than losing everyone while waiting for perfect conditions. Captain Rodriguez joined the conversation, having observed Claire's teaching approach with interest. Commander, would you be willing to conduct training sessions for incoming medical personnel? Your experience could prevent the kind of assumptions that almost cost Lance Corporal Chen his life yesterday. Claire considered the request, while mentally processing the encrypted messages waiting on her secure phone. Training responsibilities would anchor her to forward operating base Chapman, but 3 teammates were waiting for rescue that only she could provide. I'll consider it, Captain, but first I need to handle some personal business that might require temporary leave. Classified business? Rodriguez asked with understanding, born from multiple deployments where personnel disappeared on missions that officially never happened. The kind that doesn't exist on paper, Claire confirmed. As morning helicopter traffic resumed, bringing fresh casualties from overnight patrol activities, Claire found herself torn between immediate responsibilities and past obligations that demanded resolution. Every patient who arrived reinforced why field medicine mattered, but the knowledge that her teammates were alive created urgency that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Sergeant Williams, the combat medic who'd immediately recognized Claire's expertise, approached during a brief lull in patient arrivals. "Ma'am, can I speak frankly?" "Always, Sergeant. Yesterday changed how everyone here sees combat medicine, not just because of who you are, but because of how you handled pressure when everything was falling apart. That's what we need more of. People who stay calm when the world explodes. Staying calm isn't natural, Sergeant. It's trained response developed through repeated exposure to situations where panic gets people killed. How many times did you face situations like yesterday?" Claire paused, remembering countless helicopter landings, mortar attacks, mass casualty events where split-second decisions determined outcomes. Enough times to understand that fear is normal, but letting fear control your actions is fatal. Would you teach us how to manage fear under fire? Before Claire could respond, her secure phone buzzed with priority alert. The message contained new intelligence that changed everything. Rescue window limited. Taliban planning facility, relocation within 72 hours. Medical Station Alpha survivors will be moved to unknown location. Immediate response required. 72 hours, 3 days to organize, plan, and execute a rescue operation that would take her back to the place where she'd lost everything except her life. Claire excused herself and walked to the secure communications tent where she could place encrypted calls without observation. The number she dialed connected to an office that didn't officially exist, staffed by people whose names never appeared in government directories. "Blackwater Medical Division, this is Atlas." "This is Viper 7, Claire replied, using her old operational call sign for the first time in 7 years. "Requesting mission briefing for Medical Station Alpha extraction. Stand by for transfer to Operations Director." The connection shifted to a different voice, one she recognized despite years of separation. "Claire? Holy cow, we thought you were dead." "Hello, Marcus, still orchestrating impossible missions from behind a desk?" Colonel Marcus Steele had coordinated logistics for dozens of classified operations, including the original Medical Station Alpha mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. His reputation for meticulous planning was matched only by his willingness to authorize high-risk operations when stakes justified potential losses. "The Taliban has been using your old medical facility as a detention center," Steele explained. 3 heat signatures in the underground bunker match the metabolic profiles of your missing team members. They're alive, but satellite imagery suggests deteriorating health conditions. "What's the extraction plan?" That's where it gets complicated. The facility is surrounded by reinforced positions with overlapping fields of fire. Direct assault would alert guards to execute prisoners before rescue could be completed. We need someone who understands the facility layout well enough to access the bunker through alternate routes. Claire closed her eyes, remembering maintenance tunnels and emergency exits that she'd mapped during the original siege. I know ways in that aren't covered by their security positions. That's what we hoped. But Claire, this isn't just about facility knowledge. You'd be leading a 4-person extraction team into territory where capture means torture and execution. After what you've been through, no one would blame you for declining. The weight of command responsibility settled on her shoulders like familiar armor. Who's on the extraction team? Navy SEALs from Team 3, all combat veterans with multiple Afghanistan deployments. But they'll need medical guidance to assess and treat prisoners who've been held for 7 years under unknown conditions. Claire understood the implications. Her teammates would likely require immediate medical intervention during extraction, emergency treatment that only someone with her surgical experience could provide under field conditions. Send me the mission briefing, she decided. I'll review tactical options and provide recommendations within 12 hours. Claire, are you sure? This mission has significant risk factors. Those people stayed behind to save wounded Marines when they could have evacuated safely. I owe them more than tactical recommendations. After ending the call, Claire returned to the medical facility where normal operations continued despite yesterday's dramatic revelations. Patients received treatment, doctors learned field techniques, and combat medics shared experience with visiting residents who'd discovered humility was essential for battlefield medicine. But Claire's mind was elsewhere, calculating logistics for an operation that would take her back to her past in order to rescue the future she'd thought was lost forever. Admiral Richardson's aide approached during afternoon patient rounds. Ma'am, the Admiral requests your presence for briefing on new medical protocols he wants implemented across all forward operating bases. Claire followed him to the command tent where Richardson waited, with detailed plans for transforming military medical training based on yesterday's demonstration of field expertise versus academic credentials. Commander Mitchell, your handling of that emergency surgery convinced me that we need systematic changes in how we prepare medical personnel for combat conditions. I want you to develop training protocols that emphasize practical experience alongside theoretical knowledge. Admiral, I appreciate the confidence, but I may not be available for long-term training development. Richardson studied her carefully. Classified mission requirements, personal obligations that require resolution before I can commit to new responsibilities. Understood. How much time do you need? Claire considered mission timelines and extraction planning requirements. Potentially 2 weeks, depending on operational factors beyond my control. Take whatever time you need. Some debts can only be repaid by the people who incurred them. That evening, Claire received detailed mission briefings that confirmed her worst fears about her teammates' condition. Satellite imagery showed them confined in the underground medical bunker, where they'd performed surgery during the siege. 7 years of imprisonment under Taliban control had undoubtedly created medical issues that they would require immediate intervention during extraction. Dr. Patricia Williams appeared to have limited mobility, suggesting leg injuries that had never received proper treatment. Captain Rodriguez showed signs of chronic malnutrition and possible internal injuries from interrogation techniques. Lieutenant Chen exhibited respiratory patterns consistent with lung damage from chemical exposure or untreated infection. All 3 would need emergency medical care during extraction, surgical intervention that could only be performed by someone with combat surgery experience and detailed knowledge of their medical histories. Claire spent the night reviewing facility blueprints and planning extraction routes that would allow rapid access to the bunker while avoiding Taliban guard positions. The maintenance tunnels she remembered from the siege remained structurally sound, according to recent intelligence, providing covert approach options that wouldn't trigger facility defenses. At 0500 hours, she placed her final call to Blackwater Medical Division. This is Viper 7. I accept mission assignment with following conditions. Complete operational authority over medical aspects of extraction, authorized deviation from planned routes if patient conditions require immediate surgical intervention, and guarantee of medical evacuation for all extracted personnel regardless of mission timeline complications. Conditions accepted, Colonel Steele replied immediately. Helicopter extraction to staging area departs at 1400 hours. Good luck, Claire. Claire spent her remaining time at Forward Operating Base Chapman, ensuring continuity of patient care and briefing medical staff on emergency procedures they might need during her absence. She reviewed Lance Corporal Chen's condition with Dr. Webb, who had transformed from arrogant resident into attentive student, willing to learn from experience. "Commander, will you be returning to continue training programs?" Webb asked. "That depends on how the next mission goes," Claire replied honestly. "Some missions change everything about what's possible afterward." Captain Rodriguez approached as she prepared her medical equipment for deployment. "Ma'am, whatever you're heading into, it's obviously important enough to pull you away from here. Sometimes the past demands resolution before the future becomes possible. Take care of yourself, Commander. We'll keep things running smoothly until you return." At 13:45 hours, Claire boarded a Black Hawk helicopter with medical equipment specifically chosen for emergency surgery under field conditions. As forward operating base Chapman disappeared below, she processed the reality that she was returning to the place where her military career had ended and her new life had begun. The staging area was a classified facility 100 kilometers from Medical Station Alpha, equipped with everything necessary for high-risk extraction operations. She met her SEAL team, Lieutenant Commander Jake Mitchell, Petty Officer First Class David Park, Petty Officer Second Class Maria Gonzalez, and Chief Petty Officer Thomas Wilson. All combat veterans with multiple special operations deployments, but none with medical training sufficient for treating prisoners who'd survived 7 years of Taliban imprisonment. "Ma'am, we've reviewed facility layouts and guard patterns," Lieutenant Commander Mitchell briefed. "Security has been reinforced since your original deployment, but your maintenance tunnel approach should provide undetected access to the underground level." Claire studied updated satellite imagery and tactical assessments. "What's the timeline from tunnel entry to extraction helicopter arrival?" 22 minutes maximum. Guards conduct patrol sweeps every 30 minutes, giving us narrow window for undetected operations. That's not enough time if prisoners require emergency medical intervention during extraction. Chief Wilson stepped forward. "Ma'am, what kind of medical issues are we expecting?" Claire reviewed prisoner assessment reports based on satellite observation and intelligence analysis. 7 years of imprisonment suggests malnutrition, untreated injuries, possible torture-related trauma, and chronic medical conditions that would have been fatal without constant care. Any of them could require immediate surgery just to survive extraction. The SEAL team exchanged glances that suggested growing appreciation for mission complexity beyond standard prisoner extraction protocols. "Commander," Lieutenant Mitchell asked, "what do you need from us to ensure successful medical intervention?" "Complete trust in my medical judgment, even when my decisions seem to conflict with tactical priorities. Saving these people might require choices that increase operational risk." "Understood, ma'am." At 0200 hours, the team inserted via helicopter 3 kilometers from Medical Station Alpha. The approach march took 45 minutes through terrain that Claire remembered despite 7 years of trying to forget every detail. The facility appeared exactly as she'd left it, except for Taliban modifications that had converted her medical station into a prison. Guard towers, reinforced perimeters, and patrol patterns designed to prevent exactly the kind of operation they were attempting. Claire led the team to maintenance tunnel entrance hidden beneath camouflage drainage culvert. The tunnel system she'd mapped during the siege remained intact, providing covert access to underground levels where thermal imagery indicated prisoner locations. As they moved through darkness toward her past, Claire prepared for discoveries that might shatter her carefully reconstructed sense of purpose. Her teammates had survived 7 years of imprisonment because they'd believed rescue would eventually come. Now she was their rescue, carrying medical equipment and surgical skills that would determine whether their survival had meaning or whether rescue came too late to matter. The maintenance tunnel ended at a concealed entrance to the underground medical bunker, where she'd performed her final surgeries before evacuation. Through night vision equipment, she could see 3 figures lying on improvised bedding in what had once been her operating room. Dr. Patricia Williams, recognizable despite weight loss and graying hair. Captain Rodriguez, whose military bearing remained evident despite obvious injuries. Lieutenant Chen, whose breathing patterns suggested serious respiratory complications. All alive, all waiting, all depending on her ability to perform miracle medicine under impossible conditions one more time. Claire activated her tactical radio. "This is Viper 7. I have visual contact with 3 prisoners. Initiating medical assessment." "Roger, Viper 7. Extraction helicopter inbound, ETA 18 minutes. 18 minutes to assess 7 years of medical neglect, perform whatever emergency treatment was necessary, and evacuate 3 people whose survival represented both redemption for past failures and validation of sacrifices that had defined her life. Claire entered the bunker where her military career had ended, and her legend had begun. Time to discover whether legends could survive contact with reality, or whether some rescues came too late to change anything except the guilt carried by survivors. Dr. Williams opened her eyes as Claire approached, recognition dawning despite 7 years of separation. "Claire, is this real, or am I finally losing my mind completely?" "It's real, Doc. We're getting you out of here." "About time," Williams whispered with a weak smile. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about us." "Never," Claire replied, beginning emergency medical assessment. "Not for a single day." As she worked to stabilize her teammates for extraction, mortar rounds began falling in the distance. Not targeted at their position, but close enough to remind everyone that some rescues required more than medical expertise and tactical planning. Sometimes they required the willingness to risk everything for people whose survival mattered more than personal safety. The helicopter was coming. Her team was alive. And Claire Mitchell was about to discover whether 7 years of hiding had prepared her for one final mission that would determine how her story really ended. Outside, Taliban guards were beginning to notice unusual activity around their facility. Inside, 3 prisoners who had survived the impossible were about to learn whether impossible rescue operations were still possible when legends returned from the dead. Time was running out, but some debts could only be repaid when the person who owed them finally found courage to face the cost of keeping promises made under fire. Claire activated her tactical radio one final time. "This is Viper 7. Beginning extraction sequence. All personnel prepare for immediate medical evacuation." The past was about to collide with the present in ways that would define Claire's future forever. The extraction succeeded. Her 3 teammates survived the rescue operation and received comprehensive medical treatment that restored their health after 7 years of imprisonment. Claire's surgical skills proved decisive during the evacuation when complications required emergency field surgery that only she could perform. 6 months later, while Claire had resumed her position as Chief Medical Officer at Forward Operating Base Chapman, a new classified message arrived with coordinates she didn't recognize, and intelligence about other Medical Station Alpha personnel previously presumed dead. The original siege had been larger than anyone realized. The message included a photograph, 4 figures in medical uniforms standing beside a helicopter, faces obscured but bearing the unmistakable posture of combat medical personnel. In the background, a facility that wasn't Medical Station Alpha but shared identical architectural features. Claire stared at the image with recognition that transformed relief into renewed purpose. Her rescue mission hadn't ended her story. It had revealed that her story was larger than she'd ever imagined. She looked at her secure phone displaying mission coordinates that would take her to places she'd never seen to rescue people she'd never met, but who'd shared experiences that made them family. Outside her window, another helicopter approached with casualties who needed immediate attention. Claire held the secure phone for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the device that had become both lifeline and burden over the past months. The photograph on the screen seemed to pulse with possibility, 4 figures whose identities remained hidden, but whose purpose was unmistakably clear. Medical personnel who had survived impossible circumstances, just as she had, just as her team had. The weight of recognition settled over her like familiar armor. These weren't random casualties or distant operations requiring her expertise. These were people who understood what it meant to make life or death decisions when everything was falling apart simultaneously. People who had chosen to stay behind when evacuation was possible because someone had to remain with the wounded. People who knew that sometimes the greatest courage was found not in heroic actions, but in quiet determination to keep working when the world exploded around you. Through her window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Chapman, painting the medical facility in golden light that softened the harsh edges of military efficiency. Helicopter rotors echoed in the distance. Another medevac run bringing casualties who would need immediate attention, soldiers whose survival would depend on split-second decisions and steady hands that had learned to function under pressure. Dr. Webb appeared in the doorway, his transformation from arrogant resident to thoughtful physician now complete after months of learning that textbook knowledge meant nothing without practical experience. "Commander, Incoming casualties include blast injuries that might require the surgical techniques you've been teaching us. Claire nodded, sliding the phone into her pocket with practiced ease. How many? 4 Marines IED blast from this morning's patrol. ETA 6 minutes. Prep stations 2 and 3. Have Sergeant Williams set up emergency surgical equipment in case we need field procedures. Webb moved with purpose that spoke of hard-learned lessons about military medicine priorities. His earlier dismissive attitude toward field experience had been replaced by genuine respect for personnel who understood that saving lives under impossible conditions required adaptation rather than adherence to perfect protocols. As medical staff prepared for the incoming casualties, Claire found herself processing the implications of that photograph. 4 more medical personnel who had survived when survival seemed impossible. 4 more people whose rescue would require someone who understood both the technical requirements of combat medicine and the emotional cost of making decisions that determined who lived and died. The helicopter engines grew louder, announcing the arrival of wounded soldiers who needed immediate attention. But even as Claire prepared to focus on present emergencies, part of her mind remained fixed on future obligations that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. The coordinates in that message represented more than geographical locations. They marked places where people were waiting for rescue that only someone with her specific combination of skills and experience could provide. Lance Corporal Chen, now fully recovered from his emergency surgery months earlier, had returned to duty with profound appreciation for medical personnel who understood that expertise came from experience rather than credentials. His letters to family described Commander Mitchell as someone who saved lives not through dramatic gestures, but through quiet competence that made impossible procedures seem routine. Captain Rodriguez had implemented Claire's recommendations for field medical training across multiple facilities, creating protocols that emphasized practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge. Combat medics now received recognition equal to academic specialists, their experience valued as essential rather than supplementary to comprehensive medical education. The changes extended beyond individual attitudes to institutional transformation. Medical facilities throughout Afghanistan had adopted Claire's integration model, where field experience and academic training complemented rather than competed with each other. Young doctors learned humility, while experienced medics received formal recognition for expertise developed through years of treating trauma under fire. But the photograph suggested that Claire's influence could extend even further. 4 more medical personnel whose survival depended on rescue operations that required her unique qualifications. 4 more opportunities to demonstrate that promises made under fire didn't end with individual survival. They extended to everyone who shared the experience of choosing duty over safety when impossible decisions demanded impossible courage. The helicopter touched down, rotor wash scattering dust as wounded Marines were transferred to gurneys for immediate assessment. Claire moved toward the landing zone with practiced efficiency, her attention focused on present responsibilities while part of her mind remained fixed on future obligations. As she began triaging casualties with hands steady from years of practice, Claire processed the reality that her story wasn't ending with successful rescue of her original team. It was expanding to include people she'd never met, but who shared experiences that made them family, regardless of geographical separation or unit assignments. Claire pocketed the phone and returned to work, but spoke quietly to the empty room. Some promises don't end with rescue. Some promises are just beginning.
The stories end here, but the journey continues. Many new episodes are waiting for you. And if you enjoy, please take a moment to like, subscribe to our EV Story channel, and turn on the bell. See you in the next story.